everybody. Welcome to party. It's a party on Pleasant Street. Michelenie on Pleasant Street. It's Sonny Saul on piano, Michelenie on drums, Lukas Saul on bass, Quincy. And the idea here is to play some music for a little while, and then we can talk about the book, and then we can play some music again. So we thought we'd do a couple more for you while more people filter in. Right. And that was just Spiritual by John Coltrane. And the next up in the themed music for this evening, should we do this song with the underground, the theme song, or should we save that for later?
Well, let's try it. It's fun.
Okay. Yeah. This is the Song of the Underground Railroad, also by John Coltrane. You think about, while you listen, you can think about that tunnel that used to be built from Elm Street to the Ottaquechee. Used to be an Underground Railroad tunnel, like pretty long distance built out of Quincy River. It's changed a little since then, but it's local history. There we go. There's some familiar voices out there.
All right, Luna. Hey.
All right, Song of the Underground Railroad. Thank you, everybody. Maybe a little faster.
You like it slow, you like it
fast.
fast.
Okay, a little faster. you can mediate us then, alright. Trust the drum.
1, 2, ready.
No, I just thank you all for coming. It's really nice that you're here and fun to be playing. And I'm happy to play that Russell Schultz song, for whom the Marooon comics kind of originally were inspired by. And the song came out about 5 years ago, and there was a movement to get Russell Schultz, who was a political prisoner out of solitary confinement where he was for 25 years. And that it was like a real people's victory, where he was actually released from solitary confinement and he's still in prison, but it's a way better state, and it had a lot to do with the collected writings of Russel Schultz that were published, and the book tour that went across the country, and this Quincy edited a lot of actually most of the book. So it feels like a good success, and now level 2 is this Marooon Comics, which I hope I'll let you guys really take over. I think. Do you want to say something first? Or
sure. I just wanted to sort of give for people who just walked in, or maybe everyone is here already, just program run. We're going to stop playing music for a bit. Maybe let these musicians, if you don't want to sit, you're welcome to sit there the whole time, but you don't have to. You can get a drink outside. We're very lucky today to have James Sturm here from the Center for Cartoon Studies over in Way River Junction. And so I wanted to turn it over to you if you want to say a couple words, and I'm going to say maybe 15 minutes about the book, give like an overview, and then I'm really most interested in what you're interested in. So whatever, if there are particular questions, I'm going to just give an overview, and then people can zoom in as much as you want. And then we'll pause again, and you can get a drink or go home, and then the music will continue for the people who want to stick it out. So James Sturm.
I am lucky to be here. I would have been here anyway, just usually come here to hear the music, so it's nice to have an opportunity to talk about comics, which I love. I went to college in 1983, and I went to University of Wisconsin. And at the time, I was reading superhero comics, like X-Men and Spider-Man. And as much as I tried to draw a certain way, I couldn't quite get a handle on that. And plus, the content wasn't as interesting to me suddenly, as well as my world opened up in college. And my sophomore year of college, a friend of mine introduced me to this box of underground comics, and that kind of reignited my love for comics. And the underground comics, for people that don't know, there was this movement of comics in the late 60s, early 70s that was unabashedly political. It really valued style and honesty, content and honesty over style. And there was a sense of urgency to the work that I really responded to. And I didn't feel like I had to fit into a certain box. It spoke truth to power, all kinds of titles, Heads and Feds, and short order comics. And this is just a roundabout way of saying why Marooon Comics kind of, when I first saw it, I was really excited because I felt like it captured that spirit of underground comics, of having something really important to say and saying it in a forceful way that really kind of begs for your attention, but then also rewards your attention as well. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask Quincy, who's an editor of herding cats. Probably, I'll be curious to know: is it harder to herd musicians or cats, or cartoonists? So I'll let you come up.
Tough competition.
Ladies and gentlemen, Quincy Saul.
Thank you, James.
Cartoon editor.
Thank you.
Right on, everybody. So, quick show of hands. Has anybody already read the book? Or they got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we got some people already can go to that level too. So you've heard a bit about me. I guess I want to say there's 3 things we're here to do tonight. There's 1 is listen to some music. 2 is look at a comic book, and 3rd is drastically change your life. Because that's kind of all what we're looking for in a way. So if this can make a small contribution towards that. As it was mentioned, this all sort of started for me with learning about Russell Marooon Shotes, who's a living person, about 71, 72. And he's in prison in Pennsylvania. And I learned about him through another guy called Fred Ho. And it was Fred Ho's actually idea when we were working on this book over there, Marooon the Implacable, which is the collected writings of this political prisoner. Fred was like, you got to make a comic book someday about Marooon. So eventually that took place. So just to say a bit about that lineage. Just to do a real basic thing, what's a Marooon? It's not, I didn't really know the answer to that 5 years ago. It's a color in the darker reds. That's sort of what there's like a band called Maroon 5. There's like a couple things in pop culture. We basically haven't heard of this. And I think it's really important. It's a really important part of our history. And it's like actually one of the most exciting things in the history of this hemisphere in some ways. Maroons were people who got brought over, enslaved Africans, got brought over to the Americas, and escaped from the plantation. And there's a whole history of slave uprisings, but the Maroons are like this particular category of those slave uprisings in the sense they didn't attack the manor, the plantation. They left. They're like, we're going to go build our own community up in the mountains, and almost always with indigenous Native Americans, South Central, North Americans. So there was always this Afro-indigenous societies that were born in swamps and mountains and anywhere outside the reaches of where the plantation economies could get. And there's one line in there where Russell Marooon Shotes says that the efforts of these men, women, and children cannot be matched in world history. And it's it's a bold claim, but I put it in there because I think it should be challenged. Can we think of anything more amazing than what happened? So to tell a little bit about what happened, usually the way historians deal with Maroons, to the extent they deal with them at all, is to say they were pretty small groups. It only happened for very brief periods, and it was very marginal, some sort of phenomenon off on the side. And this thesis of this book, I guess, is that it's the opposite of that, is that these Maroon communities actually lasted for a very long time. The Quilombo, this famous one in Palmares in Brazil, lasted, and also the Great Dismal Swamp in the United States, I'll talk more about in a second, those both lasted longer than the Soviet Union, like over 100 years. So they were around for a long time. They were large in a lot of cases. There are some, like in Palmares, people talked about tens of thousands of people living, like a city-state type of situation. And then, contrary to the narrative that this is something that was marginal that happening on the side, there's another way to see it as that the Maroonage was really central to the whole colonial experiment, and it was always a fight against these Maroons in all the settlements. And you kind of got to dig up this history, and that was what I did, sort of editing this book. I was following the work of this man who in solitary confinement dedicated himself to studying Maroon history. And I didn't do any original historical research. I just sort of picked out what I thought were one of the most exciting, important parts and teamed those parts up with illustrators to bring it to life. I'm going to give 3 examples from the United States of Maroon communities. One of them, I think, is very important. I was really blown away to learn about this. Is the story of the first colony on this continent. And supposedly it's a mysterious story. That's what they'll tell you. The lost colony of Roanoke. They write it out like it's a mystery. Somewhere around where Virginia is now, they didn't have those lines right at that point. But people always said, oh, they disappeared. You know, what happened? And it's actually not mysterious at all. It's very clear what happened. They went and joined the Native Americans. It's a story. There were about maybe 100 Scots-Irish indentured servants, and there were about 200 enslaved Africans and about 200 indigenous people who'd been brought up from South America. And they just left them all in this Roanoke place, and then the overseers, the lords, got in the boat and went home to start the colony over the winter. And they came back, and there was nobody there. And it carved into a tree was a legend that said, "Gone to Croatan," and Croatan was the name of a local native group. So I think this is really important that the first colonists that came to this country, the first white people, decided to join the other civilization. They, rather than stay on the colonial plantation and build up that same feudal world they were used to in Europe, they were like, wow, I've got more freedoms and more of a chance to build a new life out in the swamps. And that's something you see. There's always, throughout Maroon history, you always find a small smat. It's primarily Afro-Indigenous, but there's always a small number of white people too. Particularly women who were in the sex work had more rights, and they would run away from the colonial, place where they were being awfully exploited, and would have more rights often in these Maroon communities, these Afro-Indigenous Maroon communities. So that's the first one, Roanoke. So we just know it's like things you do these counterfactual history. What would have happened if things gone the other way? It's something to think about. This empire we live in the Eastern Seaboard, maybe it could have gone a different way if that example had been followed and not buried. Another example, more familiar to people, are the Seminoles. People heard of raise hand if you've heard that word before. Okay, so very familiar with it. So the Seminoles were a mix. They were Afro-Indigenous and some white in the area that we now call Florida. Andrew Jackson, who we have on our $20 bill, his whole campaign as president was the Seminole Wars, the Indian Wars, which were really mainly slave catching expeditions. They were all the surrounding plantation economies. Enslaved people would run to the Seminoles because there was this whole autonomous zone there. So it was this serious threat that had to be eradicated, and it took a very long time. There's a couple examples. There's a guy named Osceola, who's a famous name, who was half Creek, half Scots-Irish, and he famously killed a tribal chief, an indigenous chief, because the chief betrayed the pact between the Africans and indigenous people, which is that if you ever captured an African person and sold them back to the slave, they need death penalty. So it's a really powerful example of these multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual alliances that were life and death. Another story from the Seminole War, which is really epic. Somebody should make a major movie or documentary about it or something, and yet it's hard to even find a single book about this, is this guy named John Horse. When the Indian catching wars were basically successful in reducing the Seminole areas to almost nothing, they had an exodus, or like in China you might think of the tradition of the Long March. They were basically hemmed in and had nowhere to go, or you think about the Trail of Tears, and they walked from present-day Florida all the way across up over the Gulf and into Mexico, which is the only place they could be free. And it's this whole amazing story. They were fighting the whole way, and it took like generations to get there. So that's another exciting example from U.S. history. And then the last one, which I saw you nodded your head, sir, about the Great Dismal Swamp. That's sort of maybe one of the more. There's still actually a national park by that name in North Carolina. The historic area was a little bit bigger than that. And this area that basically is this big impenetrable swamp. Very hard to live there, hard to map it. And Maroons started going there pretty much right away from the time of the first plantation economies that were started. They would run away to the colonists, the Europeans call it the Great Dismal Swamp. And there's a line in the book this guy says, is this poem that this guy wrote about it, which the illustrator illustrated. He says they fled. Britain declared their victory, and and the slaves never gave up. The Maroons never gave up. They went to the Great Dismal Swamp and staged a 160-year guerrilla war against slavery, and in the end they won. So the Great Nipple Swamp was a base during the Civil War for people to run away to or to go for reinforcements. So I think this is all very fascinating stuff, and that's just those are 3 examples from this continent, and the history actually is much richer in the Caribbean, or there's actually more recording of it. In Jamaica, in Haiti, Suriname in particular has a very vibrant living Maroon communities to this day. And that's something, I actually just had some friends who went and visited the people in the Sea Islands off of South Carolina, the Gullah Geechee community. So there are descendants of Maroons today who speak their own languages and keep that going. So the thesis is that this is very important. And I think it's not about nostalgia, right? Because it's important to know our history. But I said at the beginning, change your life. If you see your history differently, you can see your present differently and then act in a different way than you would have if you had known about it. So I give some examples in the book of modern Maroons. It's not just a history book, it's trying to give people an idea. And again, this all comes from the ideas of Russell Maroon Shoatz, trying to take these Maroon communities as a model for organizing today. And I tried to sort of identify what are the characteristics of modern Maroons or Maroons historically. A couple elements to list them. One is they were always polycultural and multilinguistic. Even when they were all African, they often had to form their own languages because people were taken from many different places on the continent. The other thing that they had in common is that they were always doing productive work. They were always gardening and growing their own food, and they were also in resistance. And the productive piece is interesting because there's all these accounts from the colonial period that people would they'd flee they'd try to take out the Maroon base, and they'd be like, wow, these people eat better than we do in the colony, because they weren't doing this crazy monocrop agriculture. They were mainly using their traditional forms of polycultures that they'd been doing in sort of Swidden agriculture, short slash and burn, is pretty similar throughout the Americas. So I think that combination of sort of building a new world and also fighting off the old one. And then the other element of it too is that it's a model of thinking that we're not going to try to take control of the existing powers. We're not going to take control of the master's house and better administer the plantation with more equality. We're going to leave entirely and do something build a new society somewhere else. So some people that are doing things like that today, I think, are all over the world. They include the Zapatista movement in Chiapas, the women's freedom movement and ecological commune movement in Kurdistan, which is Rojava. People have talked about that a bit here. I think you can talk about the forms of autonomous indigenous organizing in Bolivia, as in the Maroon context. There's an example in the book about Spain. There's an example about Sri Lanka. There's an example about the history of Ujamaa in Tanzania as an example of a different alternative development model based on village economies. And there's a lot of details. And one thing I'll say in Venezuela, this is my first experience in a Maroon community, just happened last year in November. There was a very exciting event I was at where these 3 Maroon communities hosted this international conference, international gathering. I think is like a good chapter in Maroon history was made. There's not the first time there have been Maroon conferences, but there were delegates from 5 continents living in this Maroon community, making a plan of action and getting to know more about it. I could go into more detail about any of that stuff. I'm going to rush through to the end. So some people say that the first Maroons were doing this at the time when capitalism was just getting started. The nation state form was barely consolidating itself. We're talking about 1500s, 1600s. There were a lot of swamps and mountains you could run away to and no one would ever find you. And today, it seems like there's not really that many places to run. There's it's like you can even find my house where I grew up on Pomfret in Google Maps. It's pretty sad, right, to see these, even our old childhood homes is Big Brother is watching on every little back dirt road. And these drones, they can kill anybody all over the world without a warrant, anywhere. And so is the Maroon movement, is it relevant to think about this? I think it's a good challenge to ask. Is this just old news, or could this be relevant for us? And I think it's very relevant for us. In the age of climate change and mass migration and literally just in the context of people moving to new places and building new societies, in the context of multicultural, multi-ethnic people trying to find a way together to move forward in the context of disaster and persecution, I think it's hard to find a better model than Maroons to look at for today. And then so to conclude, since we're here in Vermont, there's an interesting history in Vermont of, we can talk more about this, but I want to read to you a letter that I got from, after we did the event here for Russell Marooon Choates. There's a local author named Ron Miller he wrote a book called Most Likely to Secede about Vermont, and he sent a copy to Marooon, and Marooon sent me this letter, which I thought was worth reading. This was in 2013, written when he was still in solitary in the Frackville Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He writes, "Someone sent Most Likely to Secede, edited by Ron Miller and Rob Williams, two Vermont neighbors of yours. I have not finished it, but in addition to bringing smiles to my face, I'm astounded by the history of that area. How could a history lover like myself have been kept in the dark about such a revolutionary past of that area? A past that's to shame the truncated revolutionary credentials of the founding fathers of this country. I had read about Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, but I'd never heard the mention of the Vermont Anti-Servitude Slavery Women's Rights Republic. And for years, a serious, thoughtful core of revolutionaries who have vowed to take the best of that legacy and apply it to the horrible crises that are facing us today is also kept off the radar. Most likely to secede, indeed. I'm ready to join them, although bracing the cold season will take some getting used to. Were you always familiar with such an illustrious past of your home state? The fighting Maroons of the Great Dismal Swamp and the early Seminoles have some true comrades in the early Vermonters." So that's a challenge to all of us to carry on that legacy of the Underground Railroad, which used to be around here and in modern times. So that's like an overview, but thank you for your attention, and yeah. So anybody have any questions or comments or condemnations?
Quincy, I'm trying to imagine how it would work out. You use the example of the migrations that are happening, but let's say we wanted to disengage. The people in this room, for instance, wanted to disengage from the structures that are contributing to climate change and inequality. I mean, it feels more like a fantasy than something that can really get done, and I'm wondering how you imagine it.
Should I answer? Should I take a few and then get that, or should I just? How do people feel?
Go right to it.
Go right to it. So I don't have the answer. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here just talking. I'd be out there. I'm searching for that with you all, and I guess that's part of this book, is to throw these ideas out there and start the conversation that can contribute to more effective action on all of our parts for many reasons. One thing that might be helpful to think about in terms of the literature of marronnage, they talk about the French word marronnage is common in the literature. And they talk about some of these French colonials talked about there's two forms of maroonage. There's petit marronnage and grand marronnage. So like the small scale maroonage, and that was when they would even factor it into their bookkeeping, kind of like how today in like the retail stores they'll factor in a little bit of shoplifting. Like they know that that's going to happen in their inventory. So in the same way, these colonials back in the day, they would sometimes, especially in the Caribbean, not so much around here, they were a little bit crazier up here, but they would let the enslaved people like disappear for the weekend and go like blow off some steam and have a party somewhere, and they would come back to the plantation when it was the weekend again. So that was considered small marronnage, and I feel like that's whereas opposed to grand marronnage, which is where everybody up at once gets up and leaves the plantation and like disrupts the labor process. And maybe that's sort of the difference, is are you disrupting the mode of production? Are people withdrawing their labor and doing something else, or are they just sort of blowing off steam? And I think where most of us are these days is we're like at best petty maroons. Like we have, we on the weekend we do something for the environment, or like we like buy clothes a little more ethically, or we, but then at the end of the day we're like going back to the bank and paying our taxes. And the question is how molecular acts, small individual acts of small people withdrawing on a small scale, how can we get that to add up? That's the question. I think that this document that came out of Venezuela, these Maroon communities, have a lot of ideas about how to connect a lot of dots, because that's the challenge, is they're all keeping keeping everybody separated and their struggles separate. That's our problem right now. It sounds simple, but that's our big problem is unity. Yeah, I think the idea is we got to make sure it's not a fantasy, and we don't want to just like take the word maroon and be like, oh, I'm just going to go marooning for the weekend and go camping. It's not really true to the history of these people who sacrifice like this. But it is worthy to think about, okay, I'm going to plan like an off-grid weekend with some friends, and we're going to retreat and talk about like that thing we did up in Glover, Vermont 8 years ago. You can sort of remove yourself for a little bit and talk about, okay, how can we scale this up? How can we form confederations of people who all want to maroon together? The last thing I'll say is Russell Marooon Schultz has a great acronym. It's my favorite acronym. Calls it the Mosaic Movement of Oppressed Sectors Acting in Concert. I think that's what we're looking for, something like that. Part of an answer. If I accept that answer or not.
Well, I do, and I think that also, and maybe if people realized they were enslaved, the people who left the plantation knew they were enslaved. I think we're lulled into thinking we're free.
Now, how did you learn about Marooon and Maroons and Russell Schultz in particular?
Yeah, I got to hand it to Fred Ho. It's this guy I started studying music, and he was like, you got to check out Russell Marooon Schultz. And then I should also acknowledge my wife Kanya got involved actually before I did with the campaign. Fred told her about it, and she'd been working on it. And I remember I found an essay he had written lying around on the table, and it's in that book over there. It's called The Dragon or the Hydra, a historical study of organizational methods, and it's a history analysis of the Maroon Wars in Suriname and Jamaica. And I guess it's what you'd call like anarchist, in the sense that he's arguing for no states of any kind, but his research material is all Afro-Indigenous, and it all opens from a quote from Marx. So it's like all over the place and different than what you're used to reading, and it's all written very accessibly. That's one of the things that stood out for me, is Russell Marooon Schultz wasn't writing for people like us. He's writing for other incarcerated people who often haven't had any education. So he was taking this complex material and synthesizing it into easier words. And that made this comic book easier, because that's often the challenge of writing a comic book, is you can't make a long paragraph argument. You need to like condense ideas, not to make it less sophisticated, but to just sort of distill it. And he'd already done a lot of that work, so it's just about sort of teaming up with the illustrators.
How long did it take?
From the first time from the time Fred Ho said you should do it, that was 5 years ago, so it's like way too long. It took me maybe like a couple of years to finally get happy with the script, like sending it around to different people and getting feedback. And then once we started formally working with artists, it was about I think artists had about three or 4 months to do the work, and then about a month to design it and publish it, and accelerated in the last half a year.
How did you find your artists?
It's a good question. I'm just very lucky. I'm not a professional. It's funny because back in the day, comic books was like nobody was professional, but these days it's like it's a serious genre. It's a cartoon school. So I was very not sort of humble about going into this world. But I worked with this guy I met in New York City called Seth de Bachman, and he does there's this magazine called World War III Illustrated, and they collect everything biannual. They put out a comic book twice a year on different themes, and so he got involved through this work I was doing with Joel Covell around eco-socialism. I met this artist that way. He was actually up in Vermont at that event, and then I basically just asked him, and he's like, I think this art, I got to hand it to him. He basically I recommended the artists. And then the other exception is there's a couple of friends of mine who I met in Chiapas in Mexico, these artists, and while I was there we were working on this project. So the person who did the cover, for instance, I have got the pleasure of meeting, and is a young woman who I met in the Zapatista community, and she was doing murals there.
Has anyone in the Maroon community seen the comic, and what was the response?
Yeah, So there's I haven't witnessed anything yet. We got it. It's been taken down to the Gulagichi people. I know this youth hip hop group that took like a delegation down there, and they took 20 copies, and I haven't gotten like a detailed report about what reactions were like. I took printouts before it was bound to Venezuela, to that gathering I was talking about, and showed it around to a few people, and they dug it. It's in English, so they couldn't read it, but and then they actually just had I don't know, I haven't heard back from them yet, but I sent copies. They just had a big Marooon conference in Jamaica. It was pretty interesting. I think this idea of Maroons is becoming more people are getting excited about it. There is a conference on Maroons and indigenous people's contributions to ecological sustainability. It's like a very, very right up the alley of the kind of comic we were trying to do. And I sent, so I don't know, I'm looking forward to hearing more from that. I definitely will take this back to Venezuela at some point, and the people I know have met there.
Get there before we invade it.
Yeah, that's right. If you,
Russell Schultz has a new piece coming out, and a very brief piece in the Black Jacobin's Reader, which also Mumuya Abu Jamal has a piece in there, and Selma James, who Sonny and Quincy know, who's the widow of CLR James, who wrote the Black Jacobins, which is about the Haitian Revolution. But one of the key points he makes in there is how the Maroon community really supported that revolution. I mean, if it wouldn't for them, there wouldn't have been. And Haiti was the first country that threw off slavery, and we owe a big debt to Haiti and to the Maroons because they were the first. But also Selma, the same Selma, also edited a book about Ujamaa. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's amazing, and it's about in Tanzania how people formed another society, and it basically got crushed. So it seems like all of these communities, they don't fail. I mean, they literally, as you were saying, get crushed, and because they're so threatening. And the final point I wanted to make is just that there is a movement now called the Poor People's Campaign, which is not a Maroon community, but it is definitely a kind of you talk about mosaic, it's like a fusion, and it's not just about putting poor people front and center, but also about community care and not forming another society, but making up for what people have. So people should check that out.
I'm racking my brain. There was a very popular song, I think in the 60s or 70s. Russell Schultz's name is mentioned, and I cannot remember it to save my life.
Okay. Well,
and if I had internet, I would look it up, but I
small
can't.
town, you'll remind us to send it out.
But his name is mentioned in it. It was a hit song, and I'm sure if you don't know it, when you hear it, you'll know it.
Okay.
But I am racking my brain.
Another question there. People are
So you look at like Tucson as a Maroon kind of thing happening there.
cool. So that's a good question about the history of the Haitian Revolution that Phoebe was talking about. It's important to just say in general, without even talking about what's going on in Haiti right now, everybody should just add Haiti to the list of places they think about every day. Just in the sense that they first place and the only place in the world to carry out a successful revolution against slavery. And the first revolution in this hemisphere, and so there's just a lot to be said about that. And one of the dynamics that's very interesting that CLR James wrote about, and other people, there's this book that's coming out which is essays about this period, about the Haitian Revolution. There's probably the most famous book is called The Black Jacobin. So this book of essays, which Marooon comments on, is in as well. They're all addressing this history. And Toussaint Louverture was like he was the general who led the organized forces of the Haitian Revolution. But he was not a Maroon. He was I'm not an historian about him, but there was a division. He was like an army commander general, like wore the uniform, spoke fluent French, and was very educated. Whereas a lot of the Maroons were more people that are living out in the middle of the mountains. And there was some tension in the Haitian Revolution between the centralized military command structure of Toussaint Louverture and this decentralized Maroon communities. That's kind of what this whole essay, The Dragon or the Hydra, is about. Russell Schultz talks about how the dragon was represented by Toussaint, and the Hydra represented all these different Maroon forces. And anyway, I don't have a new theory of the Haitian Revolution to tell you today, but it's all important stuff. There was a tension with the Maroons, but it's also they wouldn't have. It was hard to say it would have been successful if everybody wasn't involved.
You call John Brown a Maroon?
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's an interesting subject to bring out of European marronage. And I think there's a whole. I almost put a chapter in the book. I wanted to do a chapter on it, but it's a little too. I don't know. I need to do more research. It's more controversial. But you can look at the history of white people who tried to run away from their civilizations, and you can look at piracy in that context. A lot of these people ran away from Europe and converted to Islam and joined in North Africa. This guy Peter Lamborn Wilson does some scholarship on that. And then there's a few examples in U.S. history of these white people who were willing to give up their lives to make the ultimate sacrifice. And their children, John Brown case, not only his only life, he brought his children to fight against slavery. I don't know if you can call him a Maroon in the sense that he, but you can. I mean, in the sense that he was building, an alternative society. I think that's part of it. You have to to be a Maroon, you have to be fleeing the fighting the plantation, but you also have to be sort of building a whole new society. John Brown maybe wasn't as good at the building a new society kind of thing, although his family, his wives were always doing that. But I think that's an important example for us to reflect on. John Brown. How can Fred Ho used to say, is it enough to be anti-racist? Is it enough to be anti-racist, or do you have to go join the Maroons, join the other civilization, join the other thing? What are you for? So I think it's controversial, provocative stuff, but at least it get us thinking.
Would the Creoles and Cajuns maybe be in the category?
I know that's a really good question. We'll have to do some research on that. I've heard about the Gulf Coast, New Orleans region being a place where there were Maroon communities, and there was certainly a very rich history of slave uprisings in that area that often would include. It wasn't exactly black and white how it broke down every time, maybe, but I don't know enough.
I don't exactly know how to say that. I'm saying it in somewhat serious and somewhat not. But you did start by saying your third point was that we have to radically change our lives.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Thank you.
I've been to 1,000 screenings or whatever it's been. And sometimes there's a difficulty, I'd say most of the time, is that we don't really know how to radically change our lives. Because we don't have an alternate system, especially if we live in the Northeast where we have to heat our homes. So when you say that, I think we all know what you mean, and I think we all agree, but practically speaking, I just go on and on decade after decade, not really changing my life radically. So, just thought you might want to comment on that a little bit.
Thank you, Anne, for your honesty. I think that's very transparently expressing the thoughts that we all have, but we don't share them publicly enough. What can I possibly say? Yeah, I mean, I think we all are aware of what's at stake here. We haven't talked about it tonight, but the sixth mass extinction and 4 to 6 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century, and the acidification of the oceans, without even talking about the social problems like the global rise of fascism and World War basically has already begun in the Middle East. If you're a Syrian, World War began like 2011. So I think that the key thing is maybe somebody can actually pass me a copy of the book up front there. I think the key thing is to I heard somebody say to me once, he said, you got to get in a fight with you got to wrestle with your own conscience and lose. Then you'll do something, There's a list in back here of there's about 10 pages of extra material. So for more study, if you want to, if there's movies, books, articles, the idea being it's like a tool you can give to a kindergartner, but then if you have a graduate student, they could also find something in here. So I could talk specifically about which basket I'm putting my eggs in for political projects in the future. But I think it's all of us have to really get in a fight with our own conscience and lose, and do that radical life change. And I think Maroons are a good example. Hopefully they can help in that process. They invented thinking outside the box. You know, it was like maybe that's a little trite, but the idea that this very radical idea, which is that there's Audrey Audrey Lorde, or it said you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. How do we live in this nation state settler colony founded on racism and genocide, but we've had some good things have happened. We got to reckon with it. We got to decide: are we gonna maroon, or are we gonna try to fix this plantation system? So I think the Maroons would say, let's jump out of it. And I've seen this all around the world. I've seen people that are like engaged in community activism to get control of their food, water, shelter, energy, and culture. I think that's one way to think about it. All your important politics you learned in kindergarten: air, food, water, shelter, energy. You gotta focus on those things and establish autonomy with them, and then confederate. That's one of the problems of Maroon societies is isolation. So if you're too isolated, you'll ultimately. So that's our job today, is for all these small experiments around the world of people that are building autonomy link up with others. And I think for me, in terms of getting the energy to make that radical life change, which requires confronting people, and people get mad at you and stuff, you know, it helps to study this history, because these people put everything on the line, and they're just other human beings, just like us, in difficult circumstances. And they, in a really disgusting, awful, horrible circumstances, they did something amazing and beautiful. So it's part of an answer. Yeah.
Yeah, right on.
You have those for sale, I presume.
And these are for sale, and I think how much are you? What are you doing?
How much are they?
Yeah, I'd say we could
15?
15 between 15.
Is that all right?
That sounds good. Yeah, so they cost 16 online. So this is definitely the cheapest way you'll get it.
And you get a concert with it.
And you get a concert.
Do I get it signed?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So thank you all so much for coming, and we can like hang out for a minute here and keep talking, and then we'll start playing music in maybe 5 or 10 minutes.
Yeah, everybody should help themselves to a drink or stand up and walk around and come back in.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks everybody. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your time and attention.
Yeah, that's fine.
What's next? You want to call one? Anybody request?
Any requests?
Yeah. Oh, they know them.
Chameleon.
Lex's dream.
Boulevard? Or
I was gonna request volleyball.
Yeah.
I don't know. How about you?
No, I'm cool with that. Whatever. I'm down for anyone.
Let's do the volleyball.
This is another song by Sonny called Bolivar. That first one was Freedom Jazz Dance by Eddie Harris.
Yeah.
Yep. And classic in the free radical jazz repertoire. And this next one is called Bolivar, which is another person who you could consider in the category of potential European Marooon. He was born to one of the wealthiest families in Venezuela and succeeded in ending his life with zero wealth at all, died totally poverty and anonymity, ended slavery in the country, and freed all of northern South America from Spanish rule. A good example of what one person can do with their life.
Can't see the list.
The last one we have Time Must Have a Stop, Ojalon, Martin Fierro. Ojalon. All right, we have a request for Ojalon there. There's Ojalon has a cameo in Marooon Comics. You have to find it. It's one panel.
Watermelon Man.
Yeah, all right, that's a later night show. Stick around.
Yeah, this next piece is from the recently composed Ojalon Suite that was written for Abdullah Ocalan recently and performed here and recorded on WCTV 8 just a month ago. And this is the third part of it, the piece that's in 3/4 time. could be it, or should we do it? Is that enough? Should we do another one?
Of
Yeah, we
course.
could do one more.
Good, easy.
Yeah.
How you guys doing?
What kind of wood is that? Walnut? Oak? The dark stuff.
Yeah, what's the
Looks like multiple kinds of wood.
good stuff?
It's a blend. It's a wood blend. I want to know what the dark stuff is.
I'll tell you.
Just give it a little knock. Maybe we get to
Oak, maple.
It is
It's more like walnut.
Any requests, Ben? You got
walnut. That's what I was
Looks
thinking.
more like walnut.
Looks like walnuts to me.
Or mahogany, maybe.
Ooh, yeah, that's the good stuff.
Next year.
They're running out of trees to make violins with. Did you know that?
Which, what?
Violins and cellos, we need specific wood. They're running out of trees.
What kind of trees are they?
They're in the jungle. They're in like South America. Like, this is crazy wood. It's a
Can we
thing.
pick a song before the generation?
Justin's gonna give a lecture on trees.
For the violins and cellos, they were running out.
Sure.
The violas.
All right.
Alexi's Dream.
Martin Fierro.
Yeah, it's a great song.
Alexi's Dream.
All right, so this is another kind of potential Euro
Say it one more time.
Euro Maroon character, Martin Fierro, who's an Argentine cowboy whose story is kind of like the national story of Argentina. It's an epic poem. Probably nobody else tries to make the connection between him and Maroons except for crazy people on Pleasant Street.
Sure.
It's in 7/4. We're gonna finally maroon ourselves from the patriotic 4/4 time. I haven't made that comment yet this evening.
Finally,
We were in 3 there.
We're in 3, yeah.
Oh,
I guess.
three.
for the evening.
But to close us out, we're gonna leave you at a different time signature.
Okay. 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
I thought we were going back in.